What's your relationship with your siblings like? Close, distant, complicated?
The day I found out my husband was cheating on me, I thought nothing could ever compare to the devastation I felt in that moment. But then I realized the person he was with was my own brother, and suddenly the ground beneath me didn't just shake. It completely gave out. I can still remember the way my stomach twisted when I saw them together, not because I had caught them by accident in some random moment, but because they clearly wanted me to know. It wasn't a hidden affair I stumbled upon. It was a carefully orchestrated reveal meant to crush me in the most personal way possible. And when my brother looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You'll never matter again," it was like he was carving the words into my skin with a knife. People always assume betrayal comes with whispers, secret texts, lies that unravel slowly, but this was a full-on performance staged to humiliate me. My husband, the man I thought I would grow old with, the man I supported through all his career ups and downs, didn't even look ashamed. He stood there with this arrogant smirk on his face, like he'd finally upgraded to something better, and he wanted me to know that my role in his life was officially over. And my brother, Michael, he just stood there, arms folded, so proud of himself, like he had finally proven he was stronger, smarter, and more desirable than me. I had seen petty rivalries between siblings before, but I never in a million years thought it would come to this. When I tried to confront my husband, or maybe I should say my ex-husband, because after that moment he was no longer my partner in any sense, he shrugged and said that he deserved to be happy and that I had been holding him back. He said Michael made him feel alive in a way I never could, and the words hit me harder than any slap in the face. All the years I had spent supporting him, all the sacrifices I made, suddenly erased as if they had never happened, replaced by his revisionist story that cast me as some obstacle he needed to overcome. And when I turned to my brother for an explanation, some desperate hope that maybe this was just a drunken mistake or something that could be undone, he didn't flinch. He said it wasn't a mistake, it was inevitable, because I had never truly mattered, not to him and not to anyone else in the family. That was the line that broke me. It's one thing to lose a partner, it's another to lose a brother, but it's a whole different level of cruelty when they both join forces to erase you from your own story. And the worst part was, my parents seemed to quietly accept it. My mother told me not to make a scene. My father said sometimes relationships fall apart and you just have to move on, as if this wasn't the most twisted, humiliating betrayal possible. I realized very quickly that if I expected anyone in my family to defend me, I was kidding myself. They wanted stability, appearances to remain intact, and if that meant throwing me under the bus, so be it. In the weeks that followed, I felt like I was walking through a fog. Friends didn't know what to say, half of them didn't even believe it at first, because who could picture something so vile? And yet, it was my reality. Every time I looked in the mirror, I didn't just see a woman who had been left, I saw someone who had been told in no uncertain terms that she was irrelevant. I replayed my brother's words over and over in my head until they became this constant hum I couldn't escape. "You'll never matter again." It wasn't just an insult, it was a curse he had tried to plant inside me, hoping it would rot me from the inside out. I cried, of course I cried, but mostly I went numb. I stopped answering calls, I stopped showing up at family dinners, and for a while I thought maybe they were right, maybe my story really had ended there. But slowly, beneath all that hurt, something else started to build. Anger. Not the kind of anger that makes you scream into a pillow and then move on, but the kind that hardens, the kind that sharpens your focus until every little detail starts to matter again. If they thought they had erased me, they were about to learn that I wasn't someone who disappeared quietly. Still, I stayed quiet in those early days, too broken to fight back, but too stubborn to collapse completely. I packed my things, left the house that was now tainted with their betrayal, and moved into a small apartment where nobody could find me. They didn't reach out, not once, which told me everything I needed to know about how disposable I was to them. The two of them paraded around town as if they had won some grand prize, showing up at family events hand in hand, while I became the ghost no one mentioned. Every photo, every memory, it was like I had been scrubbed out on purpose. That was the moment I started to realize I had a choice. I could keep letting their words define me, or I could start carving out a life where I mattered more than they ever could imagine. I didn't have a plan yet, and I certainly didn't have the strength to face them, but somewhere deep inside I knew my story wasn't finished. They thought they had destroyed me, but they had only created a silence where I was gathering strength. And the funny thing about silence is, people mistake it for weakness, but silence has its own power. They just didn't know it yet. Because as much as they believed I was gone from the picture, I was only getting started. In the months after I walked away from the life I had built, it became painfully clear that my brother and my ex-husband weren't just content with what they had done. They seemed determined to twist the knife every chance they got, as though betraying me once wasn't enough. They wanted to erase me entirely and make sure everyone saw them as the winners in a game I never agreed to play. Family gatherings became unbearable even from a distance, because every time there was a birthday, a holiday, or even just a casual dinner, I would hear through the grapevine that they had shown up hand in hand, glowing with that smug happiness people wear when they think they've stolen something that proves their worth. And my parents, rather than expressing the outrage or disappointment any sane person might expect, leaned into it, treating them as the perfect couple while pretending that my absence was simply me being dramatic. I remember one Thanksgiving where I decided, against my better judgment, to show up because I thought maybe, just maybe, enough time had passed that the shock would fade and people would see how twisted the situation truly was. But within minutes I knew I had made a mistake, because my brother made a point of carving the turkey while my ex sat right beside him, and when my mother stood to make a toast, she said she was so grateful that our family had found its balance again, and those words hit me harder than any insult, because it told me that in her mind, I wasn't just irrelevant, I was a disruption to be erased. Nobody looked at me with pity, nobody looked at me with anger. They looked at me with this blank acceptance, as if the story had already been rewritten and I had been cut out of it. My brother and my ex laughed together, whispered to each other in corners, and acted as if their betrayal was some beautiful romance that justified itself. When I tried to speak to my father later that night, hoping to find at least one ally, he put his hand on my shoulder and told me that sometimes life takes unexpected turns and that maybe I should focus on myself rather than clinging to the past. And I wanted to scream, because how could he not see that the past wasn't some vague heartbreak, it was my entire life stolen out from under me. But instead of screaming, I swallowed it, because I realized then and there that if I kept fighting for scraps of validation from people who had already chosen their side, I would never stop bleeding. So I pulled away, not in the sense of disappearing into nothing, but in the sense of drawing a line so sharp it could cut through steel. I stopped attending family dinners, I stopped answering calls, and I poured all of my energy into building something they could never touch. I took on extra hours at work, I went back to school for certifications that would double my income, and slowly, brick by brick, I built a wall between myself and the wreckage they had left me in. Every time I deposited money into my savings account, I imagined it as a little piece of my independence, a reminder that no matter how much they thought they had destroyed me, I was still standing and I was building a future that didn't include them. Of course, they still made sure to flaunt their life. They bought a new house, bigger than the one I had left behind, and my mother raved about how Michael had finally settled down, how he was so happy, and how he and his wife were planning to start a family soon. She said it to me with this tone that was half dismissal and half pity, as though my role now was simply to observe from the sidelines while the real family carried on without me. When I heard that they were expecting a child, I didn't even feel the knife anymore. It was more like salt rubbed into a wound that had already scarred, because the shock had worn off, and what remained was this cold, steady rage that sat beneath my skin. I didn't congratulate them, I didn't ask about the baby, I didn't send gifts. I knew my silence spoke louder than anything I could say, and I knew it bothered them, because Michael sent me a message one night saying, "You can either accept this or keep being bitter, but either way, you'll never matter again." That line repeated itself in my mind, just like it had the first time, but now it didn't break me, it lit a fire under me. If they wanted me invisible, if they wanted me erased, I would make myself into someone so successful, so untouchable, that even their perfect little life couldn't overshadow me. So while they paraded around town, I stayed focused. I stayed disciplined, and I stayed patient, because deep down I knew that life has a way of balancing the scales, and people who build their happiness on someone else's pain eventually trip on the cracks they've created. I didn't know how or when, but I felt it in my bones that the day would come when their smirks would fade and their certainty would crumble. And when that day arrived, I promised myself I wouldn't waste it. They thought they had mocked me into silence, replaced me without consequence, and forgotten me as if I had never existed. But the truth was, I was right there, waiting, building, preparing, and when their perfect little world finally cracked, I would be the one standing tall while they scrambled for pieces. For years, I lived with the gnawing awareness that my brother and my ex-husband had taken everything from me and were thriving in the very life they had built out of my ruin. And though I had managed to build myself back up piece by piece, I still carried the weight of that humiliation every time someone mentioned their names or described how happy they seemed. But what I never could have predicted was how suddenly everything would change with one single event that ripped the foundation out from under them. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day where I was buried in work and hadn't given them a thought for hours, until I got a call from my mother whose voice was trembling in a way I hadn't heard in years. She told me Michael had been in a serious accident, a fall that left him with severe spinal injuries, and though he was alive, he was left in a state where every move forward depended on costly surgeries and long, brutal rehabilitation. I should have felt something close to sympathy, and maybe a small part of me did for a fleeting second, but that was quickly drowned out by the bitter taste of irony. This was the same man who had looked me in the eye and declared that I would never matter again, the same man who paraded my ex-husband around as proof of his triumph, and now, suddenly, he was helpless, reliant on others for every single thing, stripped of the invincibility he once flaunted. I didn't say much to my mother on the phone. I let her talk. I listened to the panic in her voice, and I understood that in her mind this was a family crisis that demanded unity. But all I could think was how quickly life had shifted the roles. How the same people who erased me were now scrambling to figure out how to survive without my help. It didn't take long for the truth to come out about the costs. The doctors told them that without an advanced spinal surgery his condition would deteriorate further, but the procedure wasn't covered by insurance, and the price tag was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars that neither he nor his wife could even dream of affording. My ex-husband, who had once mocked me as someone too ordinary to keep up with his ambitions, now found himself drowning under bills, begging the insurance company, bargaining with relatives, doing everything short of falling on his knees in front of me. And the thought of that made me feel a twisted sense of satisfaction I never would have admitted out loud. The calls began almost immediately, first from my mother, then from my father, then from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, all circling around the same point, all hinting at what they wanted without daring to say it outright. They talked about how strong I had become, how proud they were of the life I had built, how I seemed to be doing so well financially, and beneath all their forced compliments was the same desperate plea. They needed me to save him. It was surreal, hearing their voices coated with a kind of forced kindness I had never received when I was the one bleeding on the floor years earlier, and I realized that what they really wanted wasn't reconciliation, it was rescue, and I was the only one who could provide it. I stayed quiet through most of those conversations, letting them trip over themselves with carefully chosen words, because I wanted to hear how far they would go, how much pride they would swallow, and the longer I listened, the more obvious it became that they were terrified. Michael's wife, my ex, eventually reached out directly, and her voice was raw in a way I had never heard before. She said they were out of options, that the house they had bought was on the brink of foreclosure, that every credit card was maxed out, and that without my help Michael's chances of recovery were slipping away by the day. For a moment I almost laughed, not because the situation was funny but because of the sheer audacity, the memory of how smug she had once been sitting next to him at family dinners, looking at me as though I had been discarded trash, and now here she was, begging me like I was the last lifeline left. I didn't answer her right away. I let the silence hang heavy over the phone, because I wanted her to feel it, the weight of what it meant to need me, the one she had mocked, the one she had erased, the one she had declared irrelevant. Eventually, I told her I would think about it, and the relief in her voice was almost pathetic, like she believed she had gotten through to me. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't actually thinking about whether I could afford to help. I was thinking about how exactly I wanted to play this, because for the first time in years the power was in my hands, and I wasn't going to waste it. That night I lay awake replaying the past, remembering every insult, every time they laughed at me, every moment my parents brushed me aside in favor of them, and I realized that this wasn't just about money, it was about control, about who mattered and who didn't. For years I had been cast aside as the disposable one, the background character in their story, but now, without me, their entire narrative collapsed. And while they were scrambling in panic, I was calm, because I knew exactly what this meant. The tables had finally turned. What none of them knew yet was that I had no intention of letting this moment pass without using it to make them feel every ounce of the pain they had once forced onto me. They thought they were coming to me for mercy, but what they were really doing was handing me the opportunity one had been waiting for all along. And I intended to use it. When the calls turned into visits, I knew the situation had reached the breaking point, because it was one thing for my mother or father to phone me in carefully rehearsed tones. But it was another thing entirely to see my brother's wife standing at my door with tears streaking her face, looking nothing like the smug woman who once held his arm like a prize while they laughed about how I would never matter again. She looked worn down, her eyes hollow, her voice trembling as she asked if she could come inside, and though every instinct in me wanted to slam the door and leave her standing there, I let her in, not out of compassion, but because I wanted to hear her beg in person. I wanted to see her face when she admitted that the life they had built together was crumbling without my help. She started talking immediately, her words spilling out in a frantic rush, explaining how the doctors said time was running out, how the surgery window was narrowing, how the insurance company had denied every appeal, and how they had sold off everything they could think of except the house, which the bank was already threatening to take. She painted a picture of desperation so complete that I almost felt like she was performing, and in a way, maybe she was, because she knew I held the final card. When she finally stopped, waiting for me to answer, I let the silence stretch so long that I could see her squirm, because I wanted her to feel how powerless she really was in that moment. I asked her one question: why should I? The way her mouth opened and closed told me she had rehearsed a dozen pleas, but not that one, because she hadn't expected me to make her explain why the woman they had discarded should now be their savior. She tried to recover, stammering something about family, about forgiveness, about how people make mistakes when they're young, and I almost laughed, because this wasn't some youthful error. This was years of calculated betrayal, years of choosing to rub salt in wounds, years of dismissing me as irrelevant, and now suddenly she wanted me to pretend it was all water under the bridge. I told her I'd think about it, and the relief that crossed her face almost made me sick, because she mistook my words as kindness when in reality they were nothing more than bait. I wanted her to go back to Michael and tell him that maybe, just maybe, I was considering it, because the thought of them clinging to hope only to have it yanked away later was more satisfying than any immediate rejection. I wanted them to live in that suspended state, where every call from me might be the one that decided their future, because that was exactly how they had made me feel for years, powerless and invisible. The following week I was begged to attend a meeting with the surgeon, because they believed that if I heard the medical details directly I would finally give in. As though cold facts about nerve damage and rehabilitation costs would override years of betrayal and cruelty. I agreed. Not because I had any intention of handing them what they wanted, but because I wanted to see them sitting there, waiting on me, desperate for me to say yes, and I wanted to make them believe, even for a moment, that salvation was possible. At that meeting, Michael sat in a wheelchair, looking nothing like the brother I once knew, his pride stripped away, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly, and for a fleeting second I wondered if maybe I would feel pity. But instead all I felt was the memory of him smirking at me years ago, telling me I'd never matter again. He looked at me with eyes that begged without words, and for the first time since everything had happened, I realized just how much the balance had shifted. They needed me now, and I could see in his face that he hated that truth more than the injury itself. The surgeon explained everything in detail, the costs, the risks, the timeline, and every time he glanced at me I could feel the weight of expectation pressing down, as though I were the only one who could break the silence with a commitment. My ex-husband, sitting beside Michael, actually reached across the table at one point and put his hand over mine, his voice shaking as he said, "Please, we can't do this without you," and the sheer absurdity of those words nearly made me laugh out loud. This was the same man who had once told me I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't what he needed, and now he was begging me to save the life of the brother he chose over me. I didn't give them an answer that day. I told them I needed time to review my finances, to think it over, and the look of hope that flickered in their eyes was almost intoxicating. As I left that office, I knew they believed they were one step closer to getting what they wanted. But what they didn't know was that I was already crafting exactly how I would turn this plea for mercy into the moment they would finally understand just how wrong they had been to underestimate me. They thought my hesitation was about money. What they didn't realize was that it was about revenge, and I was going to make sure they felt every ounce of it. When the day of the final decision arrived, I walked into that hospital conference room with my head held high, not because I wanted to gloat openly, but because I knew that for the first time in years I was the one steering the outcome, and all of them. My brother, my ex-husband, my parents, even the surgeon, were waiting on me like I was the center of gravity in their universe. It felt surreal, sitting across from Michael in that wheelchair, his body diminished and frail, his confidence stripped bare, and yet in his eyes there was still that flicker of defiance, as though he wanted to believe he had not completely lost the upper hand. But I could see it, the truth he could not hide, which was that without me he had nothing left. His wife, the woman who had once paraded around with her victory in taking my husband, sat there clutching his hand, her voice already quivering before I even spoke, and for a moment I almost savored the silence more than what I was about to say. Because it was in that silence that they realized how completely they depended on me. The surgeon went over the procedure again, the cost, the risks, the time sensitivity, all of it laid out neatly in a folder that was pushed across the table in my direction, as though my signature alone could change the course of fate. My father cleared his throat. My mother dabbed her eyes, and for the first time in decades they were united in treating me as the authority, which was almost laughable considering how many times they had dismissed me as a burden, as dramatic, as unimportant. I let them speak, I let them plead, I let them dress up their desperation with words like forgiveness and family, but the truth was sitting there in front of all of us. This wasn't about family, this was about survival, and I was their last chance. I leaned back in my chair and asked them all if they remembered the words Michael had said to me years ago, and when they avoided my eyes, I repeated them myself, slowly, clearly, deliberately, "You'll never matter again." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, almost suffocating, because every one of them knew the weight of those words, and every one of them knew that this moment proved just how wrong he had been. I told them that those words had been burned into me, that they had carried me through years of rebuilding my life, that every late night I worked, every degree I earned, every dollar I saved had been fueled by the certainty that someday I would prove him wrong. And now here we were, the moment he needed me more than he had ever needed anyone in his life. I reached into my bag, pulled out a folded check, and slid it across the table. The relief that washed over their faces was almost instantaneous. My mother gasped. My father muttered, "Thank God." Michael's wife burst into fresh tears, and even Michael's expression softened with something that almost looked like gratitude. But I told them not to touch it yet, because they hadn't heard what it was for. I explained that the money was not for his surgery, not for his rehabilitation, not for saving the life of the man who had taken everything from me. Instead, I told them I had already arranged for that money to be deposited into a foundation I had set up, one that would fund counseling, legal aid, and housing support for women betrayed by their families and partners. Women who had been discarded and told they no longer mattered. Women like me who had been forced to start over alone. The look on their faces in that moment was worth every sleepless night, every tear I had shed, every insult I had endured. My mother's mouth hung open. My father shook his head as though he couldn't believe I was serious. My ex-husband muttered something about cruelty, But it was Michael's reaction that sealed it. His lips tightened, his eyes narrowed, and he whispered, "You can't do this." And I smiled, because that was exactly the point. I could. I had. And nothing they said could change it. I stood up, gathered my things, and told them plainly that I wasn't denying them help out of spite. I was showing them that actions have consequences, that words carry weight, that the people you step on may rise one day and look down on you. I told them that for years they treated me as though I was disposable, but today I was the one who mattered, and the decision I made would outlive every smirk, every cruel word, every dismissal they had ever thrown at me. And with that, I left them sitting there, broken, stunned, and powerless, the check still on the table like a cruel reminder of what could have been theirs if only they had treated me as a human being instead of a stepping stone. Walking out of that hospital, I didn't feel guilty, I didn't feel conflicted, and I certainly didn't feel sorry for them. I felt free. I felt like I had finally taken back every piece of myself they had tried to destroy. For once, I wasn't the forgotten one, I wasn't the weak one, and I wasn't the one on the sidelines. I was the one who held the power, who made the choice, who delivered the justice they never saw coming. And though I knew some people might say I went too far, I also knew that anyone who had ever been betrayed the way I had would understand that sometimes the only way to win is to rewrite the ending yourself. They wanted me gone. They wanted me erased. They wanted me to never matter again. But in the end, I was the only one who mattered, and nothing they could say or do would ever change that.